All right, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, University, for the invite. The two rules of public speaking are be brief or be entertaining. I'm not sure I'll meet either one tonight, but I hope at least that I'll be informative. So the university asked me to come here and talk about the F-35 bed down. Don't really have a specific topic, so I kind of shot at the 30 to 40,000 foot level. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is an F-35, what's so special about the airplane, whether you've read anything about it in the news or not. I'm going to talk about why the Air Force and the Department of Defense chose Eielson to put these two squadrons, and then talk a little bit about the impact on the base and the community. My goal tonight is if you came here with questions at the end, I'll do my best to answer them. No promises there, but hopefully my brief will bring out some more questions as I go through it. And I will try and avoid the military jargon and lingo as much as I can, but after 27 years, it sometimes just comes out. I also am originally from Maine, so if I get talking really fast, you can just blame that on the Northeasterner in me. But I will try and avoid that and stay to my now adopted state Alaskan kind of tone. As shown here, that's my job. I'm the director for the 324th Fighter Wing. I work directly for the wing commander to plan or organize planning to bed down two squadrons of F-35s at Eielson. The thing to take away from this slide, other than the pretty picture of an F-35 over Alaska, two combat-ready fighter squadrons. So our ultimate goal, I'm going to talk a lot about personnel and buildings as I go through this brief, but our ultimate goal is to have two squadrons that, at the President's direction, can deploy around the world to fight our nation's battles, or maybe just to deter our enemies, support our allies, whatever as needed. But getting to that combat-ready fighter squadron is really what my planning is all about. It's not just construction, it's not just personnel, but it's really getting two squadrons for the Air Force that can do the nation's bidding as part of its military. So I mentioned what I'll talk about tonight, a background about the airplane itself, talk about the importance of Eielson, why we're putting these F-35s at Eielson, why, in my opinion, it was a great decision. And obviously, the Air Force is spending a whole bunch of money to do that, so they obviously think so as well. And then some impacts to the base and to the local area in terms of personnel and spending and potentially long-term as well. Okay, has anybody heard of the F-35, read anything about it? So the Air Force tends to throw a lot of terms out there like fifth generation fighter, advanced stealth, sensor fused operations. And probably most people read that in a newspaper and are like, what does that all mean? Well, I'll try and get to that a little bit as I go through the brief. But let's start with a fifth generation fighter. You're like, what, fifth generation? Do fighters have babies? No, not necessarily. That's kind of Air Force lingo talks about through history, the type of airplanes that we took to war. So first generation fighter, think of World War I. Think of an airplane framed out of wood, covered in cloth, flying over the World War I battlefields, like this picture you see here. Second generation fighters, think World War II. We've now gotten to metal frames, aluminum skim, more powerful engines, single wing, still propeller driven. Third generation, think Korea, Vietnam era. So the F-100 up here or the A-1 shown on the picture. Still some prop-driven airplanes, also now moving into the age of jets, swept wings, supersonic capabilities, that kind of moving forward. And then fourth generation fighters are what probably most of us have seen over the past 30 or 40 years. These were designed in the 60s during Vietnam and pretty much carried us through our Cold War to current day today. So a picture of an F-15 and an A-10 there, those would be fourth generation fighters. One thing throughout the first four generation of fighter aircraft of the Air Force has been, there have been improvements in physical characteristics. So they go faster, they fly further, they fly higher, they carry a larger payload. All of those things have been aerodynamic and physical improvements. When we go to the next step to fifth generation fighters, it's really more about information. So fifth generation fighters, there's only two in the world that we call that. The upper left there, F-22s. The lower right, an F-35. They look a lot alike. They're both designed and built by Lockheed, so that's probably why. F-22s are down in Elmendorf. You've probably seen them flying around Alaska. We'll see them in the pattern occasionally at Eielson. And then we'll have two squadrons of F-35s here. What sets fifth generation fighters apart, if you look at these pictures versus that last slide I showed you, especially that F-15, not a lot of different in the way they look, but it really is about information. So F-22 does have some aerodynamic advantages over fourth generation fighters. The F-35, not really a lot. As far as how many Gs it can pull, how fast it can go, how high it can fly, really similar to F-16, F-15 that's currently in our inventory. But the big thing about it is the 5th generation fighters talk to information. So up until the 5th generation of fighter aircraft, it's really been about kinetic fights, about physical things. But part of fighting wars is information, is knowing about yourself, knowing about the enemy, preventing the enemy from knowing anything about you, maybe even preventing the enemy from knowing anything about him or herself. So when we talk about 5th generation fighters, that's really the difference, is you take all those capabilities aerodynamically and physically in the 4th gen fighters and you add on some information. I hear a lot about stealth, and that's part of that information. That's part of preventing the enemy from knowing about me. Is any Star Trek fans in here? Anybody familiar with these pictures here? So this was Star Trek 4, and that upper right picture there is showing where the Klingon ship was cloned, or had its cloaking device on, and it was sitting in the park and nobody could see it. Well, that is not stealth, okay? We don't make airplanes disappear. We wish we'd have stole this from the Klingons, but unfortunately not the case. What stealth is it makes our airplanes harder to see. You go into that information dominance. So if you look at this picture, the picture on the left is representing a non-stealthy airplane. So a high-value target, maybe an enemy factory, protected by a bunch of radar missiles. And those overlapping red rings show places you don't want to fly that 4th generation fighter. The picture on the right shows what stealth can do for you. It makes you harder to see. Those radars can't see you as far away. It allows you to get in between the threats and maybe get to that target or get to support some friendly troops on the ground, whatever the case may be. But it's really not about becoming invisible. It's about becoming less visible, which is a key point. We wish we could make them invisible, but no, not quite. Maybe when Star Trek 2200 comes around. The other thing we talk about with 5th generation fighters and information is not only not allowing the enemy to know anything about us, hiding our information, but also knowing about the battlefield. So sensor fusion, wow, this great term we use. Well, what does it really mean? It means there's all kinds of sources of information on any given modern day battlefield, whether they're from the airplane itself or the sensors on the airplane, from data links, from other radars, from radio communications, all those things. Well, in 4th generation fighters, if you look at these pictures up here on the left, that shows an F-16 cockpit, what's fallen at Eielson right now, the aggressors. All that information is available to the pilot on the 2 screens on the left and the screen on the right, but the pilot has to individually manipulate all of those screens and analyze that information coming into him or her and make a decision based on what they're seeing and what they're manipulating. The picture on the right shows an F-35 cockpit, 2 great big configurable screens that present all that information in one picture to the pilot so that she can make a decision based on the battlefield situation at the time without having to analyze all that information. So we use computer technology to take all that information, put a fused picture in front of the pilot, and ideally increase decision making to make us more lethal to the enemy and also more able to protect friendlies. So this is, most of my career I spent flying A-10s, protecting our own soldiers on the ground. Well, when you have a great picture of the battlefield presented to you in one picture, it makes decision making that much easier versus trying to take 3 different screens in your cockpit, analyzing a small piece of information from either one to figure out what's going on. So when we talk about sensor fusion, it's a great big word, but what it means is just presenting information that's really easy to make decisions from. So when we talk 5th generation fighters, I'm stealthy, so I'm hiding and preventing the enemy from knowing anything about me. And I'm also collecting a whole bunch of information and presenting it to the pilot in a way that's really easy to see and make decisions. So I am dominating the information by knowing it, ideally knowing it all and presenting it all in a way that's easy to understand. Added to the cockpit of the F-35, the F-35 has, normally 4th generation fighters have what we call a HUD, a head-up display, which is a piece of see-through glass that a picture is projected upon. So if you look at the front of the airplane, you can kind of see how fast you're going, how many Gs you're pulling, any kind of targets that are in that field of view. But that's kind of it. Well, the F-35 doesn't have a HUD. All of that's presented in the front of the helmet to the pilot. So wherever the pilot looks in the sky, they see all of that information that I talked about is sensor fused there in the cockpit. It's also wherever they're looking. So if they look outside, they can look over their shoulder, for instance, and see that not only is that their wingman over there, but they'll get some information in that helmet-mounted cueing system that is their wingman. In fact, that's number 2, and he has 15,000 pounds of gas and these weapons on board and all of that kind of thing, just wherever they're looking in the sky. Pretty amazing system. Again, all about information and knowing and dominating information. All right, I'm going to pause right there. That was probably pretty high level, but trying to get a little bit of a picture to you as the taxpayers of why do we, why are we spending $100 million in this airplane? What makes it special? So that's kind of a big overview of, we talk 5th generation fighter, we talk stealth, we talk, information control. Is there any questions at this time that you want to ask about the airplane in particular before I move forward into why are we putting it here at Eielson?
Yeah. Well, it's not specifically about the plane, but how many fighters are in a squadron?
So the Air Force, depending on the type of squadron, it's either 24 airplanes or 18 airplanes. So we will be active duty squadron, so there'll be 24 airplanes per squadron. So a total of 48 primary assigned aircraft. Each squadron also gets 3, they call them attrition airplanes. So this is awful, but if you look at the lifespan of a fighter squadron over a 50-year period that we expect to fly the fighter, we expect we're going to lose 1 or 2 of them to crashes, due to accidents, due to battlefield, whatever. So each squadron will get 24 primary assigned aircraft and 3 battlefield attrition inventory aircraft. So a total of 54 coming to Eielson. For the Guard and Reserve units that are getting F-35s, they get 18 plus 2. So a little bit smaller squadrons in the Guard and Reserve component.
And they're here also?
Nope. We're just getting 2 active duty squadrons. Yep. But there are F-35 units, or Guard units getting the F-35. Vermont and Burlington, Vermont's getting a squadron of F-35s. Reserves in Fort Worth, Texas. Reserves in Montgomery, Alabama. So and those will be smaller squadrons than we're getting. But the active duty squadrons that are at Hill Air Force Base currently and that we'll be getting will be 24 airplanes per.
Yes. Instead of the airplane, you just described new pilots. How long does it take, even after lots of ground training, in order to be able to be competent and fly the airplane without embarrassing yourself?
So, so the Air Force is really good at training pilots who've been doing this for a long time. Pilot training to get your wings is a year. And then after pilot training, you get selected to go to, or you get a choice, and the instructors get a choice on what airframe you go to. The basic course syllabus for the F-35 is about like the F-16. It's 7 months long. And they teach that down at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. So about 7 months, probably 40 sorties and 30 simulators to get basic qualified. It means you can go out and be a wingman who can go to war. Not a leader, not an instructor, just basic wingman. There's one other question.
Has Hill deployed their squadrons?
So Hill has done some deployments for training with one of their squadrons. To Mountain Home, to Nellis, to the Pacific. But so far that's it. All right. Yes?
On the F-35, when they had the combined screen, I realized the plane's generating part of that information, but how is the outside information coming to the plane in a rapid session?
So data link.
Ground.
Yeah, so radio communications. So there's data link radio communications with other assets that are on the battlefield that the airplane communicates with.
So there's a complete support teams for all that, generating that information.
So between the airplanes as well as other, so currently 4th generation airplanes have data link called Link 16, but the interoperability between all the advanced systems, so 4th gen fighters, some of the modern Army ground combat vehicles are all on one network. Yep.
Well, I'm just curious, what is the anticipated lifespan of an F-35?
Well, the Air Force right now is talking a 50-year lifespan. So as I meant to mention this as I went through the generations of fighters, we have the oldest fighter force we've ever had in the U.S. Air Force right now. The second oldest would have been that first generation, from World War I really to World War II, but that was 20 some odd years. Our F-15s and F-16s, a lot of them were made in the late 70s and early 80s. Our A-10s were made in the late 70s and early 80s. We're a really old fighter force, but we expect the F-35 to be around even longer. So 40 to 50 years is probably the best guess. One of the reasons is we build them more capable, but they also get more expensive. So replacing them more often gets harder and harder.
But well made.
Yes, and you do spiral development. So an F-16 that came off the line in 1978 doesn't look much like an F-16 that's being built and sold to partner nations right now by Lockheed. Much spiral development throughout its life. And the F-35 should be the same.
Thank you.
Yes.
How many F-35s are currently produced?
How many? I don't know that answer right off the top of my head. I know we have 2.5 squadrons at Hill, so that would be in the neighborhood of 50 some odd airplanes. 3.5 squadrons at Luke, so and that's Air Force only, so that's another 80 airplanes or so, a squadron at Nellis. So a few hundred thus far. That's the other thing. I'm talking about Air Force F-35s. That's the F-35A. This is a joint and coalition airplane. So there's a B model that the Marines are buying that can do vertical takeoff and landing. There's a C model that the Navy's buying that has longer wings and more fuel adapted for carrier operations. As well as that, there's been partner nations involved with the F-35 program from the beginning who have been involved in design, engineering, setting requirements, building pieces and parts of it, and also buying it. Those are the partner nations. There's also foreign military sales where those countries didn't get a vote. They just get to buy it at the end. So, and that varies. And pretty much a lot of the nations that have F-16s, a lot of our NATO allies are involved in the F-35. All right, I'm going to talk next on why bringing them to Eielson is important, and in my opinion was a great decision. So it's great to have brand new airplanes, but if you, going back to the pilot training, if you can't train your pilots to be combat ready, then the airplanes really do you no good. And when you look at what assets are here in interior Alaska, I would argue are unmatched anywhere else in the Air Force where we've put F-35s. I'll get into specifics on each one of these, but airspace and ranges, where we can go fly the airplanes, air assets to train with, so the F-22s in Elmendorf and the 18th Aggressor Squadron who simulates foreign adversaries here at Eielson, as well as the ground assets that are available at Fort Wainwright to integrate for a close air support training. So, for those of you that, anybody in the room pilots? A few, okay. So this picture here shows the military operating areas of the JPARC, the Joint Pacific Alaska Range Complex. It is huge, unmatched anywhere else over land in the Department of Defense, 120 miles by 240 nautical miles. Not a lot of population in that airspace other than Fairbanks, Delta, and North Pole. Not a lot of restrictions in that airspace because of airline traffic and those type of things. So some of the greatest training you'll ever find is here in interior Alaska because of the size of our airspace. Especially for 5th generation fighters. I talked about their sensors and how much information they can gather and display. They really want about a 100 mile by 100 mile container to fight in, to practice fighting in, because of how far they can look and how much they can know. If you crunch them down much, they can't use the full capabilities of those sensors. So Alaska is really outstanding from that from an airspace standpoint. Just to put in perspective to other airspaces in the lower 48. So there on the right side of the screen, they show the Nellis Range Complex, which is really a high-end range. It's where we do Red Flag Nellis. It's where the Fighter Weapons School is for the United States Air Force. And then if you take that little red container there on the right and put it inside of the Joint Pacific Alaska Range Complex there on the upper left, you can get 4 of them inside of the airspace here in Alaska. It is incomparable in size in terms of what we have here in interior Alaska versus what is available in the lower 48 for range airspace. Added to that, because Red Flag Alaska is here at Eielson Air Force Base, our ranges are very well equipped with targets and threats for our pilots to train against. So that F-35 doesn't drive those requirements. Those requirements are already there. Those ranges are already good, but it's just a benefit that we're bringing F-35s here to train on them. I was the last director of operations, so second in command of the A-10 Squadron when it closed. And not only was I personally mad about that, because I wanted a couple more years here in Alaska, but I was disappointed in the Air Force because the training opportunities here in interior Alaska are just amazing and incredible. You will not find better. And there's some of these pictures, these are target sets that are actually on our ranges that simulate enemy airfields, enemy factories, enemy artillery pieces, you name it. Out there for Red Flag Alaska, but will be available for F-35s to train to. Same with threats. We have threat simulators out there that simulate enemy radars or enemy infrared missiles. And again, every day will be available for F-35s to train to. And you don't have that at Hill Air Force Base, all of that combined in terms of the size of the airspace, plus the targets, plus the threats. As well as I mentioned, Fort Wainwright being right down the road. So one of the primary missions of the F-35 is going to be close air support. So the ability to interact with the Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, the Air Force guys that go out with the Army to call in air in support of the Army, the ability to train with them every day and brief and debrief with them face to face, the ability to train with the Stryker Brigade and with the Aviation Task Force, all of those assets at Fort Wainwright will make the pilots here better, the ground guys at Fort Wainwright better, and we as a DoD better. So that certainly doesn't exist at Hill or Nellis or Luke. That ability to have an Army base right down the road to train with every day. So I would argue from a training potential, as taxpayers, this should please you that the Air Force made the decision. Because we count readiness based on the number of sorties pilots fly in a month, 8 or 9, depending on their experience level. We don't talk to quality of those sorties when we're rating that readiness, but the quality of sorties that pilots will get here, because the ranges in airspace are so close, they're not going to waste any gas going to and from where they can tactically maneuver. The quality of the ranges they will be able to employ on in terms of targets and threats, then the assets they'll be able to interact with in terms of the air assets, fighting the aggressors at Eielson, interacting with the F-22s out of Elmendorf, as well as the ground interaction with the Fort Wainwright. You're going to get the best bang for the buck training of any F-35 units, bar none, that we've put out there so far. So it gladdens me to see the Air Force make this decision to bring fighters back to interior Alaska with an air-to-ground mission, because frankly, we probably had a wasted use of Air Force assets with the ranges that were only getting used during Red Flag 8 weeks out of the year. All right, so I'm going to get to a little bit more of why we brought him here, but I'm going to talk some operational impacts real quick. So another thing I want to talk to for the nation and for the Air Force, why Eielson's F-35s are a little bit different, is we're an additive mission. So at Hill Air Force Base and at Luke Air Force Base, we took an F-16 squadron away and put an F-35 squadron in. Here at Eielson, we're not doing that. We're putting 2 F-35 squadrons on top of all the mission that is already at Eielson. So that means a lot for the local community. It also means a lot for the Air Force, because the Air Force has been shrinking since 1990. We're starting to slowly eke out a reverse to that trend, very, very slowly. But this is the first step towards that. Lakenheath Air Base over in England will also get 2 squadrons of F-35s that'll be additive. So the fact that we're growing our Air Force gives our national leaders more flexibility. More squadrons that you can deploy when needed gives you more flexibility. So I'd say that's a pretty important point from a national strategic and operational standpoint to take away, is that these aren't replacing F-16s, they're additive to current inventory. And then the other reason that Eielson's so important, I talked about the training, is this map here. Most of the folks in the world don't look at the Earth from the top, from looking down at the polar regions. But this globe is meant to show that Eielson Air Force Base is 1 fighter sortie away from anywhere in the Pacific theater or anywhere in the European theater. So in terms of our allies in those 2 theaters and allaying any fears they may have of competitors, we're 1 sortie away. In terms of reacting to a threat in North Korea, we're 1 sortie away. In terms of maybe just deterring some aggression from China or Russia, we're 1 sortie away. So being at Eielson strategically, as long as you have tanker support to get the fighters in theater, is a huge plus for the country and the U.S. Air Force. So when you look at the training plus the strategic location, I would argue that this was an excellent choice from the Department of Defense's standpoint. And just a quote, got to have the quote from the dead guy in every briefing. So Billy Mitchell was an air power visionary that pushed for a separate Air Force back right after World War I. He didn't get his wish before he got court-martialed, but he visited Alaska after World War I, and that's what he said: most central place in the world for aircraft. So he was prophetic. This was before we had tankers that could haul fighters a long way, but we're making that come true now, and if you look at that picture of the globe, it certainly is. So, any questions on why we're putting F-35s at Eielson before I move into a little bit of local impacts?
Question, if you define what you mean by 1 sortie away.
So, fighters are, if we have tanker support, so we can air-to-air refuel, we're only limited really by the length of time we can keep a pilot awake. So our normal crew duty day or air crew duty day is 12 hours. So from the time the pilot shows up to brief until they're shutting the engine down, we try and target 12 hours or less. So when I talk about 1 fighter sortie, it's really limited by that ability to not get fatigued and start crashing airplanes. So when we look at a 4,000 mile, that's probably about an 8-hour flight, add a couple hours prior to takeoff and about 45 minutes after landing, and you can get to Europe or the Pacific within that 12-hour window as long as you got a tanker to give you gas going to and from.
Sorry if I missed this. How many other squadrons are there in the United States? And I wish they'd keep this a secret because it's such a big thing and so much money and it's going to be right close. So if we're only one sortie away from other people that are just that far from us. But just curious, so how many in the United States, how many squadrons are there currently at F-35?
So there's 2.5. They're working on the third one at Hill Air Force Base in Utah. Those are operational like ours, meaning they're go-to-war squadrons. There's 3.5 going towards 6 at Luke Air Force Base down in Arizona. Those are training squadrons that'll train all the pilots that come here and go to Hill. There's a test squadron to continue to develop the aircraft at Edwards Air Force Base in California. There's a test squadron at Eglin Air Force Base down in the Panhandle of Florida. The Marines have them at Yuma in Arizona, as well as Iwakuni over in Japan. And I don't know where the Navy squadrons are as of yet. So across the Department of Defense, we're pushing 10 squadrons. And then some of our partners already have squadrons as well. Australia, Turkey, Great Britain, one other, it escapes me now. So we're the other thing about Luke Air Force Base, anyone that's flying the A model, so the Air Force model of the F-35, partner nations are training with the U.S. down at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona as well.
Where would the F-35 find its most tactical advantage in the event of a problem, say, in the Pacific?
Where would it find its most tactical advantage? I probably can't answer any specifics on that. Just know that, yeah, just know that we're buying them for a reason. Yeah. All right. Any others?
And what's the fuel range on this?
So the airplane carries 18,000 pounds of fuel. There's no external fuel tanks to put on it like an F-16 or F-15. So pilots down at Luke were saying a 2.5 to 3 hour sortie is not uncommon. If they're just cruising like cross country, figure 400 knots, so 400 nautical miles an hour for 3 hours, so 1,200 nautical miles, probably range without refueling. So when you talk about going 4,000 miles, you're going to do probably 5 or 6 air refuelings to cross the Pacific, across the polar region.
What can it carry for missiles?
So internally, there's 4 weapons stations, and you can also load 5 external weapons, 7 if you count the wingtips for missiles. So externally, 2 missiles, 5 of any kind of air-to-ground weapon, and internally, a mix of 4 air-to-air, air-to-ground weapons.
How long does it take to paint them?
To paint them? I don't know that answer, but I can try and find it. I will say that stealth technology and maintenance specifically has developed a lot since the F-117. So maintaining the F-35 has been a focus of the Air Force and its requirements and a focus of Lockheed and its development to make that a much easier task. Because a lot of the older stealth technology is known to be a bear to maintain, really difficult to maintain. The F-35 is better, but I don't know how long it takes to paint one.
Yeah, I heard it takes 24 hours.
That's probably true, but by the time you do it and cure it, yep.
How many pilots are in each plane?
I have a slide later that talks about personnel, but it's a single-seat airplane, so there's never more than 1 in it, but our squadrons will be manned at 1.5 per aircraft. So if we're getting 24 airplanes, we'll get 36 pilots for that squadron.
Is the plane, like on the systems and the engines and stuff, transmitting the information back to home base, what's happening?
Nope. That was a thought that Lockheed had early on, and there's some security issues with that. So now when the airplane lands, the crew chief plugs in a laptop, downloads all the maintenance codes, plugs that into the mainframe computer that orders the parts, orders up the fixed jobs, and then maintenance pulls those fixed jobs off the computer and goes to work. Yep. All right. So, go ahead.
The armaments to support these sorties will also be stored?
Pardon?
All the armaments,
yeah.
Weapons are all stored there at Eielson?
Absolutely, but mostly training. So it's really expensive and really hard to move live weapons around the world. So the US tries to have war reserve materials scattered around the world in theaters that we may go to. So we're not going to store a bunch of bombs and missiles here at Eielson that we'll take to war, because it's just frankly too hard to load them on airplanes and fly them anywhere. So we are building some munition storage out here, but it's really a lot for training munitions that we'll use day to day. So we'll talk a little bit about impacts. Construction, I'm sure you've seen a lot about that in the news. The borough has a regional growth plan that they hired a company to put together. A couple slides out of that talking about population and then some maybe long-term impacts for the community and the base. So big picture at Eielson, 39 facilities either renovated or new, and $589 million in construction from FY16 to FY20. That is a lot. There's a lot going on. If you drive by Eielson now, you'll see the cement trucks, you'll see the folks going in and out. It is a busy, busy place. The Corps of Engineers has their handful just to keep the contractors from interfering with each other. We're so busy out on the South Loop. And we have some challenges. You all know that. You live here in Alaska. Weather drives our construction season. As we all know, driving around Fairbanks right now, all the roads are in construction. Building a building in Alaska is no different. If you don't get the ground prepped, the concrete poured, the frame up, and a roof on it before winter, you're done. So all of our projects really are designed to start in May, at least if they're new builds, so that we can get them closed in by October, November, and the contractors can work over the winter. We're an additive mission. I talked about that earlier in the operational sense, but it's also a big deal. When you see this price tag, you're like, oh my goodness, that's ridiculous. Well, we're putting 2 squadrons of F-35s on top of everything that's at Eielson, and nothing is leaving Eielson. So we've renovated buildings where we could. So the old A-10 building, we renovated, we put the current F-16s in there. The old A-10 hangars, we put the current F-16s in there. We're putting the 1st squadron of F-35s in the old F-16 buildings, and we're building new for the 2nd squadron. A lot of our back shop maintenance, engines, X-ray machines for doing non-destructive information, you know, see if a part's cracked or whatever. A lot of those back shop maintenance units are just getting a few more bodies for F-35 maintenance. So we're just renovating like a couple of offices to make room for a few folks. But the one thing we are doing is having to build a place for every F-35 to live, because we can't fly them off the ramp. The jet doesn't mind 40 below. At 40,000 feet, it's 40 below. So the jet doesn't mind, but our poor maintainers sure do. So to get to 2 combat-ready squadrons, we have to be able to fly a high sortie rate. We aim for a 14-turn-10, so 14 sorties in the morning and 10 sorties in the afternoon. The way to produce that many sorties is to have maintainers working hard without having to take breaks due to cold, without having big, thick, heavy gloves on, whatever. So every one of our jets will be stored indoors. So we're building 2 massive 16-bay weather shelters, plus using the existing 8-bay and 4-bay from the F-16s. And a couple 4-bay heavy maintenance hangars. So a lot of this money is really to do with that sortie generation and taking care of our poor maintainers who have to turn wrenches year-round out here to keep our sorties going. Real quick, I'm not going to belabor these. I'll just kind of go quickly through the slides. These projects other than the simulator facility are done, and that'll be done in October. The Temp South Gate, we just did a renovation there so we could get construction traffic away from the front gate, make it easier on everybody going in and out, and make it easier on the rich highway traffic. The state did us wonders by putting in those turn lanes there, so we didn't totally muss up folks trying to go to Valdez and go fishing. FY17 was our big MILCON year. A lot of money, a lot of buildings, including, as I mentioned, those 2 big 16-bay weather shelters. Those are under construction right now, as well as those 2 4-bay hangars that are also associated engine maintenance and operations building. Somebody asked about weapons storage, so that top, there's no picture there because our weapons storage is well away from main base, but we're building 6 munition storage bunkers up on top of Quarry Hill, and that's what that top arrow on the left, or on the right shows, I'm sorry. And these are all awarded and under construction other than the munitions maintenance facility that's in the lower left. The bad news story for Alaska commercial construction has been kind of a good news story for Eielson Air Force Base. So the fact that oil is not spending a lot of money in commercial construction and the state is not spending a lot of money in commercial construction has made our bids really competitive thus far. That lower left munitions facility is our one exception. All the bids were too high on that, so we're having to go back and ask Congress for more money. But other than that, as it stands right now across the entire program, we've awarded all through FY18. We're about $15 million under what Congress has authorized. Million, yep. Only. Well, out of 576, I'll take 15. And that's because some of them have been over and some have been under, but as an overarching, we're under. And again, it's been because there's been a lot of competition for commercial construction in Alaska. It's a bad news story for the overall Alaska economy. It's been a good news story for DoD, though. These 18 projects are all awarded and underway as we speak. So we've done pretty well.
Any new infrastructure being built
So
outside of the F-35 buildings, et cetera?
not really. So Air Combat Command is our daddy rabbit for money. So they're in charge of F-35 bed down worldwide. We do every 6 months a large planning conference where Air Combat Command and Pacific Air Forces, who we belong to, and us all get together to define requirements. If we can't tie a base requirement to the bed down, ACC won't write a check. So some things that are kind of on the edge, I would say, that we've managed to push through. You see up there a satellite dining facility, top left. Flight kitchen, we don't have one right now. Our maintainers, we pay them BAS and expect them to bring a nice lunch with them. Yeah, what they bring is a monster and a candy bar. So we're gonna give them a hot meal in between lunch and sorties. And that was one that we got through ACC by saying, this is about sortie generation. It's about taking care of airmen and sortie generation. We don't have a flight kitchen. They could have said, that's a current-based problem, we're not fixing it. They decided to fix it. School-age facility. So we provide pre and post K through 5 school care on base right now. But our school-age facility only houses 100 students. We're expecting 147 more to come in. It's not big enough, it's old, it's terrible. We convinced ACC that is a mission requirement because when we have a single mom crew chief on the F-35, there's no supervisor in the world that's gonna let her leave work at 2 in the afternoon to go pick her kid up from school, take him to daycare in North Pole, and then come back to work an hour and a half later. So when you talk about infrastructure, we've done some things that aren't directly about flying sorties on the base, but most of it has been about sortie generation for F-35s.
Eielson almost was closed twice.
Let me give you a microphone here.
Eielson was almost closed twice in recent times. What is changed strategically? Why is it all of a sudden the center of the 35?
Right, and I think that goes back to the 2 points I made earlier. The strategic location is important. And when we were looking to close Eielson in 06, 07, that was kind of almost the bottom of, our heated relations with Russia, frankly. We were pretty friendly at that time. Right now, Russia's become more of an adversary, but I think the bigger reason is the training potential. Training to high-end tactical aviation in the lower 48 is getting more difficult by the day because of the airline traffic, because of the encroachment of communities around air bases and around ranges and airspace, because of noise complaints. And so Alaska offers that ability to train at a very high level that is really getting scarce in the rest of the country. And I think the Air Force, when they were looking at putting F-35s in the Pacific Theater, realized that. And compared to other places they looked at for this bed down was Elmendorf, which isn't as close to the ranges as we are, and they're already pretty crowded on that ramp and housing-wise. They looked at Misawa, Japan. They don't have nearly the range complex we have. They looked at Korea, and there was all kinds of concerns with putting them there. So when you look at the Pacific Theater, Eielson really made the most sense, but I would argue it's probably a lot to do with that training because that's getting really hard to do in a lot of other places around the country. This last slide, FY19, these are requirements that are not yet funded. So we're a slave to the budget like every other part of the government. So the FY19 budget hasn't been passed yet, but these are buildings that we do need to add to complete. School Age Center, we've gotten head nods all the way through Department of Defense on these. These are at Congress for funding right now. We expect they will get funded. We have great support from our local CODELs, so our congressmen, our 2 senators. So I expect these all to be funded, but I can't tell you they're going to happen yet because until the check's in the mail, these are requirements, not realities. People. Eielson's growing a lot. About 50% growth. Eielson right now is about 6,800 folks when you talk about airmen and their dependents, and we're adding about 3,500 when we talk about airmen and dependents. About 1,245 funded active duty positions, that's civilians or NCOs or officers. And the fiscal year's here, so starting this October, we'll start flowing people in. We've already had 27 cops come in and man that south gate. Starting this October, we'll have the initial cadre, the folks that are gonna set up the buildings and set up the mission and get ready for F-35, experienced F-35 maintainers and operators. 78 of them will show up between this October and next September. And then starting next October, October of 19, that's when we're really gonna ramp up in ahead of the jets and during the jets. So 500 folks and then 622 the next year. There's also 140, this says 147, it's now 149 positions that we've identified that aren't funded yet, but are needed for Eielson's growth. Kind of, you talked about infrastructure. So when we initially got direction from ACC, they said, you need 70 pilots, 980 maintainers, and a few personnelists and civil engineers and other kind of base support folks. Well, those base support folks weren't gonna be enough. So those additional 149 we've identified for funding are really a lot about base support because Eielson is unique compared to, you know, the generic F-35 base. As well as the active duty military and their families, we're expecting about 65 to 80 permanent contractors. So Lockheed Martin has folks that come here for IT jobs as well as maintenance jobs. And then Pratt & Whitney is the engine manufacturer, and they have 4 or 5 expert technicians that go with every F-35 bed down. So we're expecting about 3,500 people. It's about a 3.5% increase to the borough and about a 50% increase to Eielson Air Force Base. This slide, thank you to the Regional Growth Plan, Agnew, Beck, and Arcadis, was developed, the borough, for those of you unaware, the borough put some of their own money forward and got a DoD grant for the rest to hire a strategic planner for the borough on what does the F-35 bed down mean to the borough in terms of this population growth. And so this slide here is straight out of the draft regional growth plan that's out there for your view and comment by Arcadis and Agnew Beck. And what it shows here is that red growth would be directly attributed to the Eielson folks. The blue growth is what they, or the blue box or area under the curve for the calculus folks in the room, is what is considered induced growth. So by bringing those Air Force folks here, they create other jobs in the community, whether that's in healthcare, in retail, in education, whatever it takes to support those families. So you look at this, the growth in the borough, there was gonna be growth due to more births and deaths. That's the bottom line, the black line. The red is the direct Air Force growth, and the blue is the induced growth. So we talk about 3,500 bodies, but when you look at the induced growth, the regional growth plan is estimating about 5,600 relative to what added to what would have been the baseline had the F-35 bed down not happened. So pretty significant when you're looking at a borough of 100,000 people. You know, that's 5%, a little over 5.5%. Economic impact that goes right along with that. This is out of the ACU's brief that just happened out at North Pole High School. The DoD brings about a 1.2, and this is Wainwright and Eielson, about 1.2 billion into the economy. 20% of all jobs and 38% of all wages are directly attributed to DoD, whether that's actual DoD folks or induced jobs because of those DoD folks. So for every $1 million DoD spends, about 4 jobs in the community. The projected change, and this is just Eielson Air Force Base spending on the F-35 bed down. This is not induced growth in the community. This is literally Eielson only. About 26 million, it's about a 50% increase in what Eielson's budget is every year, and a $65 million increase in payroll, also about a 50% increase, direct on the base. And that's estimated out of the environmental impact statement we did for the bed down. So pretty significant long-term impact there. The short term is the construction. There's lots of local subcontractors working on Eielson right now. We're putting a lot of people to work. But the long-term impact is probably a bigger deal for economy of the borough, I would argue. And then I would also look at, you know, who in the room is a veteran? Anyone besides me? So quite a few. Alaska has the highest per capita number of veterans. When you bring people here like me that like to hunt, fish, ski, camp, hike, they tend to fall in love with the place and come back. So I would say by adding more personnel to Eielson, the odds are you're going to add more people that either separate and stay here or retire and come back here just because of exposure to what this great state has to offer. So from a long-term resident and job, I'd say that is a good thing for the community, as well as the permanent jobs that Eielson's going to add for not the military folks who come for 3 years and leave, but for the people who want a job and want to stay in Fairbanks. So whether those are the, excuse me, the Air Force civilian wage grade or G Series, General Series employees, or the Pratt & Whitney and Lockheed folks, they're going to be in those jobs as long as they want to be, as long as they want to stay in the community. So pretty big impact for long-term residents and jobs over the long term. Talking really fast there at the end. Probably the stuff you guys are most interested in too, right? The money, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. And so, final slide. This picture, just as a side note, does anybody live in Moose Creek? No? It's a long drive coming here for this. So this past winter, we had an F-35 here for about 4 months doing cold weather testing, and then 6 F-35s for about 3 weeks doing some different cold weather testing. So this is a picture from this winter that our PA folks took of an F-35 on the ramp in the winter at Eielson. Excuse me. Should I have a glass of water? All right. I will take any questions you might have.
Did they finally put the chutes on them?
They did. So so you knew about the cold weather testing, huh? So the reason that this airplane was here, this is a developmental test bird, and the first thing they wanted to do is figure out how it handled on icy runways. They get that accomplished. The Norwegians don't have the benefit of a 14,000-foot runway like us, so they're going to use a drag chute to stop it on their short icy runways. So yes, they did install the drag chute and do some takeoffs and landings with it. It all went awesome. The jet handled really well on slippery conditions.
Off-base housing demand?
Yep. So this regional growth plan talks to that. Oh, thank you. Kind of in depth. Jeff, you got to leave? You going to leave at this question, really? So what the regional growth plan shows is that there are bedrooms in the community for every one of our inbound personnel. Where there's a shortage is right now the folks that are at Eielson, employed by Eielson, and live in the community, 85% of them live in the 99705 zip code, probably for convenience. The estimate is there's a shortage of about 200 units, so whether it's homes or apartments, in the 99705 zip code. So if the community does nothing at all, every one of our airmen will have a home. It just may not be at the quality or the price or the commute distance that they might want. I will say the community has really stepped up to this problem, and I've seen building increase in North Pole, and I think they're looking to push even more to get those houses, frankly, where our airmen currently show they want to live. And for my personal, I work on base. My wife's a nurse, works at Fairbanks Memorial. North Pole's perfect. And I think we have a lot of airmen married to folks with careers, professional careers, that like that commute different directions, that convenience. And then, frankly, in the winter, commuting from West Fairbanks to Eielson would not be a lot of fun. So yes, the housing, there are bedrooms available. The shortage that the regional growth plan shows based on their studies is in that 99705 zip code. So North Pole, Badger, Moose Creek.
Where are the pilots going to sleep?
Where are the pilots going to sleep? So on base or off base?
If you need them in an emergency, don't take off.
Oh, yeah, so that's been asked a lot as we've gone through this housing is, do we have a requirement for how fast they get to base? The answer is no. The Air Force, when they go look at housing in a community, they look at 20 miles or 1 hour, whichever's less. So as long as they're living within an hour, we're good.
I think that would be critical path.
Well, it usually takes longer to generate an airplane to leave than it does for somebody to drive to the base to get in and fly it. So there's a lot of maintenance actions that goes with prepping an airplane to go to war. So.
Definitely true in Alaska, definitely true under our conditions.
Would it be fair to say that the greater the technological, would it be fair to say that the greater the technological advance, such as this aircraft, the greater the unreliability? I have read where there are plenty of bugs in this aircraft.
Yeah, and I will be honest with you, the press always wants to dig into the bad news story, but if you look at the mission capable rate of the F-35, it's actually exceeding expectations. When I was down at Hill Air Force Base about 4 weeks ago, the maintainers down there said they could produce more sorties than operations has pilots to fly. So the jet has been really reliable for one is young. So if you look at when the F-15 was brand new, or the F-16 was brand new, they had lots of growing pains. The F-22 had lots of growing pains. The F-35 has some, and it had some, especially 2 or 3 years ago. We found a lot of things. As soon as we went from test to operations, we started flying more sorties. We had some trouble with some heat liners around the engine, some things like that Lockheed has already fixed, but the jets coming off the line right now, the 3F jets, are kind of exceeding expectations for FMC. But you're right, the more things that, just like cars, the more things in the car that can go wrong, the more that will. In fact, interesting thing about the 5th generation fighters, I talked about you land, crew chief plugs in the laptop, downloads all the maintenance data. There have been many sorties of F-22s and F-35s where the pilot lands and says, yep, good to go, great airplane, code 1. Maintenance plugs in the laptop and went, no, we have 7 jobs to do. So sometimes the jet knows itself better than, so it performed every mission asked of it by the pilot, but there were things noted that were wrong with it because of the technology. So, but yeah, right now, knock on wood, the jet's exceeding expectations for mission capable rate. I hope that continues when we get ours.
How stable is the funding?
For which part?
Support the whole program. Pick one.
So for Eielson, we have been incredibly fortunate. This past year, as all you know, Congress once again did not pass the budget on time. And we, as I talked about our winter construction cycle, have to start in the spring. So we forwarded through Air Force leadership channels as well as through the senators' offices that we were going to be dead in the water if we didn't get funding to start our MILCONs. And they actually put an anomaly in the last continuing resolution. So continuing resolutions, they fund the government piecemeal. Usually that doesn't allow you to do a new start on anything. An anomaly means they went, well, we're going to break the rules and fund your military construction projects so you can start. So I'd say for Eielson, the funding, I don't know how you could get more stable than Congress going out of their way to break the rules on our behalf. For the airplane, the Marines have put all their eggs in this basket. Their force was even older than the Air Force's. The Air Force is putting a lot of eggs in this basket. So I would say, what are the chances of the program being canceled at this point? Extremely low. What are the chances of the program being curtailed, like the Air Force not buying 1,000, the Marines not buying 400? Potential. And that is all about per cost of airplane. So if some of our allies and partners start backing away like Canada's doing, the cost per aircraft goes up for every less one bought. So I think there's a potential to not buy the entire buy. This is my opinion, not the Air Force's. They'll tell you we're on contract to buy them all, but as we've seen with other recent modern fighters, the initial plan and the actual execution ended up different. But as far as the program, yeah, I don't see how right now, just for how long it takes to develop a fighter, the DoD has to move forward with buying these because the Marines have no other option. The Air Force doesn't have many.
On that exact point, is it potentially 20 years to generation 6? That's my other thought.
They're talking about that. The big brain folks in the Pentagon are thinking about that right now. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Program Agency. What does the 6th generation fighter look like? Is it manned? Is it full size? Or is it a bunch of little bitty swarming drones? But that thought is out there. Right now, the Air Force is focusing on the F-35, the KC-46, the next tanker to replace the 135s, and then the next bomber to replace the B-1. I'm not sure the next fighter's on the drawing board yet because there's so much other that we need to invest in to maintain our force.
I know you're.
Oh, go ahead.
2 questions. Number 1, are they meeting the need for maintainers now? And then number 2, is there any synergy opportunities between the university and the Air Force to help meet personnel needs, for example?
So the first question is mostly. So the Air Force has taken incredible strides to meet maintenance requirements for the F-35. The way they've done that is contract out training-coded fighter squadrons. So Eielson Air Force Base, 18th Aggressor Squadron, has contract maintainers. So they took all those military maintainers and sent them to other weapon systems that have a combat quota that need to deploy and hired contractors to support them. They've done the same down at Luke Air Force Base, Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, which was my last assignment where they train A-10 pilots, contract maintainers. Little Rock Air Force Base, C-130 training, contract maintainers. So yes, we're meeting the need. We're doing that by robbing Peter to pay Paul, if you will. We're taking maintainers from other jets that don't deploy for the F-35, filling back with contract, hopefully to grow the force to get rid of those contractors down the road. That's the plan. Second question is excellent, and the answer is absolutely yes. Finding qualified personnel in the IT realm, in the security realm, in the maintenance realm, in interior Alaska is difficult. We have been telling Lockheed Martin, you better do something. You better open your checkbook, or you better partner with the university, you better partner with the community, you better do something if you want to hire 65 to 80 highly technically trained folks in this borough of 100,000. So I think the university absolutely has some opportunities for partnering with both the Air Force on some of the GS civilian side for security and maintenance experts, and especially with Lockheed Martin on the IT and maintenance side.
I know you're an Air Force guy, but I've got a question regarding the Marines. I always had a theory that they just bought the strangest things out there, the Ospreys, the Harriers, things like that. Is the vertical takeoff, is their requirement, or is it just, what is their criteria for buying the plane?
So I'm not an expert on Marine doctrine, though I am somewhat an educated person on military doctrine. So their expeditionary mindset is they want to be able to operate from austere locations. And so they don't always think they're going to have an 8,000-foot runway. So that vertical takeoff and landing is important to them. The other reason is they have huge money invested in their big decks, their amphib boats. And yeah, they can put Marine birds on Navy carriers, but they like to take their own boats to war usually. So their big deck amphibs require that short or vertical takeoff and landing. So yeah, that was a requirement. The funny thing is if you look at the A model and the B model, unless you get underneath or on top of it, they look almost identical. The Navy model, the C model, bigger wings, is bigger in every dimension. So it can carry more gas and fly slower on final to land on the carrier. So it's the one that is notably different than the other two. Yeah.
Compared to the F-15 and 16s, how's the component exchange? Is it faster on this plane, or is it more complicated?
It's actually faster, and that's a double-edged sword because the current 5th gen maintenance approach is the maintainers at the base don't fix anything. They identify the problem and they replace the whole box. Send the box back to Lockheed for them to dig into and fix it. So engines, normally we would in an F-16, we have engine troops that will tear them down to nuts, bolts, compressor blades, you name it, all the way down and rebuild them all the way up. Well, the F-35 engine is 5 modules. All we're allowed to do at the base is replace the whole engine or one of those 5 modules. If anything goes wrong internally with one of those modules, take the module, send it back to Pratt & Whitney, drop in a new one. So yes, easier to do those line replaceable units because the airplane was designed that way. But it does affect how we do maintenance.
Kind of on your second part, you were answering on that, like some of the other planes that be like major repairs or major, we're changing out engines and doing a lot of work to the plane or doing mods to it. Is there designated areas that this plane will go to where they're going to gear up to work on that plane or not?
So, yeah, the one thing I would say for local operations is we've designed our 2 large 4-bay hangars to be big enough to pull an engine out the back of the airplane and put a new one indoors. So we've kind of designed our infrastructure to be able to do all those kind of things in a environment control building at Eielson Air Force Base. As far as major, and the other thing is like F-16s, A-10s, they have what we call phase schedule. So phase maintenance. So every 500 hours, you pull panels, you look at hydraulic lines, you look at electric lines, whatever. There's no phase maintenance on an F-35. Now, there are scheduled inspections, but that bigger maintenance, like 5,000, 10,000 hour kind of milestones will be depot level done by Lockheed. Just like now we send F-16s to Air Force depot level down in lower 48.
What is the date that you expect them to be here?
So we will get our first 2 airplanes in April of 2020. The Air Force's contract with Lockheed is anytime within that month. So Lockheed could deliver them on the 1st or the 30th, but we'll get them in April. That'll be the first 2. And we'll get 54 airplanes in less than 2 years. The last deliveries are scheduled for January of 22. So it's an aggressive delivery schedule for us versus some of the prior bases.
Could you comment on the expected demand for healthcare services in the facility and community?
Sure can. So 3,500 more folks with the same kind of healthcare demands that the 6,800 at Eielson have right now. And that is one of our problems. So our site action task force that meets every 6 months to look at requirements to plan this bed down, one of the areas we look at is medical. Medical's red right now. Not because the F-35 bed down's causing it, but because here in the local area, we have some critical needs specialties that aren't meeting DoD demands. Ear, nose, and throat, OBGYN, mental health are the three that have been identified. And that is either a lack of providers or a lack of providers that take TRICARE, lack of military providers. It's kind of all those intermixed. So the Air Force is partnering with the Army and with the community to try and address that. But that is a current problem that Fort Wainwright and Eielson have that's going to get exacerbated by 3,500 more folks.
You've extolled the virtues of your airspace, and I think the map you showed even included some new airspace that's about to emerge. Are you also planning any upgrades on the infrastructure to allow military pilots to communicate with civil pilots when they're using that airspace?
So absolutely. Right now, the coverage of the ASOS, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the ability to talk to range control, the coverage of that south of the range is not great. And so they are adding in, and I don't know the exact dates on this. D-Chan might be able to get with Red Flag to get the exact dates. But yeah, they're planning to add in more radio transceivers for that communications because I fly them all, and so I'm south of the Tanana River a lot, and so I understand your exact concerns. Our moose strip is a few miles north of R2211, so the ability to talk to range control and find out what's going on with military pilots and whether the airspace is active is absolutely critical. And it's pretty good right around here, but you know as well as I, once you get south of the range or far southeast is where it breaks down. And they are planning to put in more radio communication capability because of the Fox MOA going down and Paxson MOA standing up. But I don't know dates or times. Your face is familiar. I know you're involved with AOPA locally, right? Yeah. Have you talked to Bob or Terry about that? They might have more information on the dates. Yeah. But yes, there is plans for that because that obviously we military operating, for those that aren't pilots or MOAs, military operating airspace does not restrict civilian VFR pilots from flying in there. They can fly in there whenever they want, but we really don't want, I don't want to be in my mall with an F-16 flying by at 400 knots. That could be a bad day for me and maybe for her as well. So the ability to talk to range control to find out what's going on with the military airplanes is important. F-35s are generally going to fly at higher altitudes. They will have some low requirements specifically for weapons delivery, so on 05 and 11. But yeah, we're gonna have more congested airspace. We're gonna be flying 48 more sorties a day outside of Red Flag than we do now. Sure.
Are there any other questions? Okay, just a minute, I'll bring you the microphone.
There's a sound problem that's going on now at the Eielson with just the planes that you have there now. What's the F-35s going to do to that, and how are you going to handle it?
Yep, so that is a great question. There's been a lot in the press about how loud the F-35 is. And frankly, it depends. It depends on if they're doing an afterburner takeoff or not. It depends on if they're doing an unrestricted climb or not. It depends on what the cloud deck is like or not. My personal, just being outdoors listening this winter, to me the F-35s didn't sound any louder than an F-16. But I think where the noise issue is going to come in is right now the F-16s fly 18 sorties a day. We're going to add 48 more to that. So if you're on base at Eielson or you're in Moose Creek or in northern Salcha, if there's times now in the day where you get a conversation interrupted by an F-16 takeoff, those instances are gonna be more often. I'll be honest with you, there's no other way around it. It won't be what we have during a red flag though. So during a red flag, we're launching, 140, 150 sorties in a day. It'll be 1/3 of that on standard steady state operations for the F-35. But yes, we are going to increase the noise footprint just because of more sorties per day.
Can you hear them in Fairbanks when they're making touch and goes?
Yes, absolutely. But we don't, now the military fighters, we don't use Fairbanks International other than for occasional low approaches for instrument training or emergency diverts. So we don't get up there very often. A local air orientation for a pilot, he'll probably do a couple instrument approaches there, once a year check ride, a couple instrument approaches, but we try and stay away from Fairbanks with military fighters because they're not used to us, we're not used to them.
It was just for future briefings. I used to be a non-destructive inspector, and so it's a destructive inspection.
Oh, thank you.
So, for if you're doing radiation,
Yep.
ultrasonics, background, all this. But also, do the people know, like, tankers you're talking about? That's like the 168th right here. You know? So, yeah, there's a piece 135, 707, so we feel. But you didn't mention anything about the air guard.
Oh, so obviously the point of my briefing was the bed down, but yeah, we will rely from a training standpoint on the 168th because to maintain readiness, every pilot has to hit a tanker every 6 months, and we're blessed that we have a home station tankering unit to do that. We don't have to bring folks in from out of town. Sure.
In some ways, a similar question you're making me think, is the Army and Fort Wainwright going to have to step up a bit to do a bunch of coordination?
I would argue that's on the Air Force. As a former A-10 pilot, I would argue that's for us to reach out to them. So our wing, for those of you who don't know it, so we talk about the Eielson's wing. We see F-16s, we see Red Flag. One of the groups in the wing, and it's geographically separated, is an Air Support Operations Group. And those folks that train to integrate with the Army and call in close air support right now are not getting the training they needing because of a lack of air. And we have an Air Support Operations Squadron at Fort Wainwright that has to go TDY, has to go somewhere else to get controls to maintain their training. So if we can't fix that internally, then we have a problem. But yes, I would argue, yeah, I don't think the Army will have to step up their game, but we're gonna have to build some relationships and some connective tissue that was cut when the A-10s went away and the F-16s converted to an air-to-air only mission, because those synapses don't fire right now because there's no need for it other than from a airspace integration. If the Army's shooting artillery, we need to stay out of their way, and that type of thing. But in terms of that close coordination, yeah, we're gonna have to rebuild those relationships.
How about, is there one more question? Right here.
Kevin, I've heard the Secretary of the Air Force say that the Air Force recruits airmen and retains families. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the kind of priorities are for big Air Force? And with all this talk about the 3,500 people coming here, what can we as a community do to help the Air Force meet its goals?
Jeff, that is an excellent, excellent question, because we've heard somebody asked a question earlier about maintaining maintainers, keeping maintainers in the Air Force because we're short, about keeping pilots in the Air Force because we're short. But really it is about keeping families, because what will cause a military member to say, I'm done with this, is usually because their family's done with it. We don't want Eielson Air Force Base to be any airman's last assignment because it was so bad. So what can the community do? Well, we're already addressing some of that, right? So we were worried about housing. We think we're on glide path for that. But quality housing, quality education, and then all those, we say quality of life, but what does that mean? It means access to restaurants and nightlife and retail and recreation and all those kind of things, and a neighborhood that embraces them. I mean, my first assignment up here in 1998, we had a great tight squadron that passed along a lot of information, but Alaska is hard to figure out if you're a newbie. But if an airman moves into your neighborhood and you can help them know what's fun to do, what there is to do, what restaurants to go to, what are, all of that kind of stuff, so they feel welcome, and then go see how great, frankly, the Fairbanks North Star Borough is, because they've had that insider information, then that's the best we can do to make sure this isn't their last assignment, because that is a strategic issue for our entire Department of Defense, is ability to maintain and keep the good ones. And one bad assignment is how you lose a good one.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Blanchard. This was absolutely